So I really regret that we do have that situation at all, and I think it's outrageous that we cannot give people access to their human rights.
Well, isn't the very point that you've just made, that there are now so many fewer people making the crossing and ending up in Italy or indeed Malta or southern Spain from the sea route, doesn't that make the point that Mr. Salvini, who is the sort of poster politician for a new, tough, anti-migrant policy in southern Europe, his policy is working as a deterrent? It has actively deterred many, many would-be migrants from making that highly dangerous crossing.
Well, we don't know that because we haven't spoken to them, I guess.
But they're just not coming, that's the point.
Yeah, and the question is why they are not coming. I mean, the European Union is building a border. They're doing an externalization of that border already far south of Libya. So they're already deterring people from entering into there. They're also pulling back via the Libyan Coast Guard people to a country at civil war. And the death numbers are as high as they have never been in the relative death numbers.
Well, yeah, they're not,
exactly.
In absolute terms, they're not as high, but the number of deaths of migrants at sea is proportionately higher now as a proportion of the overall number making the crossing than it was in 2015, 2016, when the overall figures were far higher. But let's get back to the figures, because they're quite extraordinary. Arrivals by sea to Italy have dropped by 84% from the 2018 figure, 97% down from the 2017 figure. So right now, as we speak today, Italy, with its tough stand, has ensured, let us be honest, that thousands of people who were going to attempt to make that crossing and would have put themselves at risk are no longer doing so. That should be celebrated, shouldn't it?
I'm not sure that the credit here goes to Italians. It's the whole of the European Union which has withdrawn their rescue vessels and which is complicit in the Libyan Coast Guard pulling back these people, as I said, to a country at civil war.
Would you not accept that, and you're right, it's not just Italy, but Spain and Malta and Greece as well, all of whom now have a real tough stand on not wanting to let these vessels land and actually launching criminal prosecutions of some of the rescue mission workers, such as yourself. This has had a real effect on the mentality of people who might have made the crossing. And you surely don't want tens and tens of thousands of people to make that crossing, do you?
I think we have to see the fact that migration, as such, is just a fact of human lives. I mean, everyone outside Africa has come from Africa sometime, right? The point is that due to the whole, history of colonization, the large inequalities between the global poor and the global rich, there is a lot of reasons for people to migrate. And there's a lot of injustice between people around the globe. And as long as we don't resolve that, people will just migrate, and particularly due to the climate breakdown.
Well, we'll get to the climate breakdown and how important you feel that is as a push factor away from sub-Saharan Africa in particular. But let's just stick with this notion of yours that migration is just a fact of life. I come back to the figures which suggest actually there's been a fundamental change in the last couple of years. And I also come to the fact that some players in the Mediterranean are quite clear that the rescue missions that the private humanitarian organisations such as Sea-Watch run are actually counterproductive. The head of the EU border agency Frontex, Fabrice Leggeri, said this a couple of years ago when he was looking at what groups like yours were doing. He said that rescue operations need re-evaluating. He said that NGOs are ineffectively cooperating with national security agencies. And he said NGOs who rescue people in the sea off Libya are actually encouraging the people traffickers who profit from dangerous Mediterranean crossings.
Yeah, and such accusations have been also mentioned against the Italian Coast Guard when they were rescuing during Mare Nostrum.
Which they no longer do.
But it was the absolutely same accusations. In the week that Sea-Watch started their operation, 1,000 people drowned. So it was first people were trying to cross the sea, and then the civil NGOs were a reply to that. It wasn't the other way around.
But address Frontex's testimony. They've had officials in North Africa who have spoken, for example, to the people smugglers, the traffickers in Libya, who've openly acknowledged putting people onto these dinghies which are clearly not seaworthy, not capable of travelling the 200 miles to southern Italy. And they say, well, we don't care if they can't make the 200-mile crossing. All they need to do is get 20 or 30 miles offshore out of Libyan territorial waters, and we know that these NGOs will pick them up and take them to Italy. You're, in a sense, offering a taxi service, and the people smugglers are exploiting you.
Well, you can also look at the numbers from this year, where, for example, on the days where there were rescue ships out there, on average there were 33 people leaving from the shore, and on the other days when there was no ships, the number was 35.
I just wonder if you feel you're not being a little patronising, not least to the Libyans. Throughout this interview, you've said that you don't trust a word the Libyans say, that you think the conditions inside Libya and the detention centres for migrants are appalling and inhumane and contravene international law. The Libyans respond by saying that you, NGOs, do not respect them and that you won't work with them and that you are consistently undermining their activities.
Well, we do cooperate to the degree which is complicit with the law, but we can, of course, not accept instructions such as bringing people back to Libya, because that will be a non-compliance as set with the Geneva Convention on Refugee Rights.
You've mentioned the international conventions concerning migrants at several points in this interview. I just wonder, from your experience yourself, working with Sea-Watch for some time, whether you truly believe that most of the people crossing from North Africa, attempting to get into southern Europe, are genuinely fleeing persecution and conflict, or whether so many of them are actually, for very understandable reasons, economic migrants.
Well, they all come from Libya. And
well,
Libya
they come
is
through
a country.
Libya. Most of them are not Libyans.
Libya is a country at civil war. So, in my position, I'm a sea captain, right? And I see the boat in distress, and it really is not my position to judge how and why someone came here. And if you wanted to know that, I think it would be interesting if you were talking to these people, and then you could ask them why they're traveling, and they could give you the reasons.
But you see, you say it's not my position to judge, and I well understand that, but it seems to me at points you do judge. For example, you've said to me, many of these people who've come through Libya from sub-Saharan Africa, they're what you call climate refugees, and you've said in the past that Europe has a duty to accept these climate refugees. But, I mean, that may well be your moral, ethical position, but that doesn't match international law, and it certainly doesn't mean that they are eligible for refugee status.
Yeah, I mean, international law or law as such is an interesting thing because it's always formed by the society, right? And it can change. You see there were times where, for example, slavery was legal, women didn't have a right to vote. That doesn't mean it's morally right. And climate breakdown as such is still a fairly new topic, if you want. So it's still not included in the UN refugee rights.
No, it's
but
not.
It doesn't mean that it's not going to happen in the future.
But it does mean that if you and others like you...
And it also doesn't mean it's morally right.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm just exercised by this because if you are to take your logic to its conclusion, you would, and other NGOs would recognise the obligation to help these what you call climate refugees. And there could be millions of them, literally millions of them, seeking over the next 10, 20, 30 years to enter Europe. Are you saying that Europe has a legal as well as moral obligation to take all of these migrants?
Well, we have to look at the facts, which are first and foremost that most people, when they migrate, they go very, very short distances. Because especially the global poor just don't have the money to move very far. So when we're thinking of the effects of climate breakdown, like changes in precipitation, crop failures, famine, most people will starve very close to their homes. They're not going to come here. You know, the percentage of people who cross a border is very low. Most then stay in neighboring countries. So really we're talking about possibly or much, likely higher numbers than we have now. But most of the people who will be displaced, think of Wales. You have coastal erosion, for example. Some people will have to move homes and so on. But then not going to Canada. They're going short distance.
Your view of the moral, ethical obligations is very different from that of most people in Europe. Do you recognise that in the end democracy has to be acknowledged and recognised and respected in Europe? According to the Pew Research Centre, 71% of Italians want fewer immigrants or no immigrants at all. Very different from your perspective.
Yeah, and I think that opinion probably comes from, as I already pointed out now several times, the lack of solidarity within Europe when we're talking about receiving these
people have a solidarity. They have a solidarity to what they see as defending their national interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when we see, for example, people in Germany which have been surveyed, I think in June, then 65% said they would like to welcome people. So there's differences within the European Union. And I certainly understand that Italy was bearing a far too great share of the responsibility within the EU.
Final thing, will you go back to sea again and conduct more rescue missions?
Yes, I certainly would. However, I'm a nature conservationist, so I might work on other issues in the future.
Carola Rackete, it's been a pleasure to have you on Hard Talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
That was an edition of Hard Talk presented by me, Stephen Sacker. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts. Podcasts. 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 Podcasts.